Hello everyone, Sam here, and today we gotta talk about BITTEN, the secret history of Lyme disease and biological weapons. This is a nonfiction book, not a fiction one like I normally do, but a nonfiction one. And this was written by Kris Newby and published in 2019. That's going to be significant in this review, as you'll see. Kris Newby is not an author I'm hugely familiar with, and the main reason being is that before she got involved with Lyme disease, she was actually a technology writer. I think on the back here it says she wrote for different tech companies. Yeah, it says on the back here she was a technology writer for Apple and other Silicon Valley companies. Not something I'm hugely in tune with, so I hadn't really heard of her in that aspect of her career. But nowadays she is more associated with being an advocate for Lyme disease victims. And the story about it, which is sort of talked about here in BITTEN briefly, is that Kris Newby and her family were vacationing at Martha's Vineyard. And while she was there, she and her husband came down with Lyme disease. And this was, I believe in the book it says 2002. And they got Lyme disease, and it heavily affected them for several years because they weren't diagnosed properly, and Lyme disease, if it's not treated fairly rapidly, can have very long-term health effects. So she was suffering quite a bit during this period of her life, and she started getting into Lyme disease advocacy, as well as looking for ways to help her and her husband deal with long-term Lyme disease. So she started an investigation to the origins of Lyme disease, and she's been doing this for like almost, I think it's about 2 decades now. She did a lot of investigations into Lyme disease, particularly into the origins of Lyme disease, because there's a little bit of a gray area there with where it came from, as we'll soon discuss. And she became an advocate for Lyme disease victims, and she even produced a documentary. I believe it was titled, on the back here, the documentary is titled Under Our Skin, and it was premiered, I think, in about 2010, maybe 2009, and that was the documentary that she helped make that discussed Lyme disease and the controversies around it. BITTEN is not so much focused on that element. BITTEN is, in fact, kind of a nonfiction narrative story, and it discusses a few different elements of Lyme disease. The main thing it discusses is the career of Willy Burgdorfer, who was a Swiss scientist who immigrated to the United States to work in the United States biological weapons program. He didn't necessarily start that way, but he eventually got into the biological weapons program, and he was actually the one who discovered the microbe associated with Lyme disease. And Kris Newby heavily suggests that it might have been because he might have been one of the folks working on the on weaponizing viruses and microbes during the biological weapons program that ran the United States from the 1940s to the 1960s. So it's an examination of Willy Burgdorfer's career in the biological weapons program. It also discusses the sort of complex politics with Lyme disease, particularly within the medical establishment. And it also discusses Newby's investigation into both Willy Burgdorfer and Lyme disease itself. And she finds there's actually a lot more intertwining them than a lot of people initially thought. So this is not necessarily written like a pure scientific book. It's written more like a narrative. It's Newby writing like the story of Willy Burgdorfer and all the things that went on in her own life when she got Lyme disease. And it sort of writes it more as a narrative than like a pure journal that's just saying everything that happened in pure scientific detail. It's more of a nonfiction narrative book. And I got this book because I was, I got it from my local library. But I got interested in this book because I had read an article, I think like 2 or 3 years ago, that heavily quoted this book. And the article was about the strong implication that the United States government created Lyme disease, or at least exacerbated an already existing disease that would turn into Lyme disease. And so I was told about that book, about this book from that article. And that's the main reason I got this, because the last couple of years it's been a high time for diseases running rampant in our world. So this was definitely on my mind the last few years. So to get to the actual review, I'll first talk about what I think works in this. I say story, but it's a nonfiction narrative, but I'm going to call it a story because, in a sense, it is. I think you can reasonably call it that. The thing I really liked about this book was how much it examined Willy Burgdorfer, because all of the sections focusing on Burgdorfer have this really impressive eye for detail and discussing about how he went from just being like this Swiss student at this little medical college to being one of the most important scientists for the United States. And it shows how when he first goes to Montana, there's a facility in Montana, I believe it's Hamilton, Montana, that's focused on studying various tick-related diseases. And he initially goes there to study Rocky Mountain fever, because that was a common disease there in that area of the West that was spread by ticks, especially among livestock. And so he goes there to study Rocky Mountain fever, and initially trying to like develop vaccines and treatments. But as the Cold War starts stretching on, the U.S. government finds other uses for Willy Burgdorfer's skills, particularly in regards to fleas and ticks, as that was Burgdorfer's specialization. And the story does a good job at sort of painting him as a complex man. He starts out with this noble goal of like trying to cure diseases that harm people, but as time goes on and the circumstances he's surrounded by go on, he's sort of pushed into getting a career focused on causing diseases more than healing them. So it really paints an interesting portrait of this Swiss scientist who starts out with really noble intentions, but due to his Cold War surroundings and the demands of his profession, it kind of gets roped into doing pretty questionable experiments. So that the parts of Willy Burgdorfer are really fascinating. I also think the story does a really good job of showing the intensity of Lyme disease's effects. Because I think a lot of people kind of just assume that Lyme disease is just like, oh, it's like a bug you catch for a week and then it's gone. And it's like, Kris Newby clarifies, well, that can be the case if you get treated nice and early, but if you're not, you can be in a fair amount of trouble health-wise. And if Lyme disease isn't treated, Kris Newby shows, yeah, the effects can be very long-lasting and very uncomfortable. I remember growing up, my family went to a trip in Virginia, and we were in the Virginia mountains, and we stopped by this like little ranch place where you could ride horses. And my father, and this would have been like around 2018, 2019, he refused to go anywhere near the horses because he said this. He told me this is a Lyme disease area. There had been cases of Lyme disease in that area of Virginia, and he was going, I do not want to get anywhere near a horse that could have a ton of different fleas on it that might jump onto me. So it was kind of a thing of, and my father had a medical background, so he was kind of aware of what could go on with Lyme disease. So that always sort of stuck out to me as I got older, just seeing how scared he was at the idea of exposure to Lyme disease. And this book kind of shows why he was right to be scared of catching Lyme disease. Not just because of what the disease could do to you, but the fact that the medical establishment may not always be having your best interests at heart if you do have Lyme disease. Because the other thing that's really well highlighted in this book is the essentially the corruption of the medical establishment. Because Kris Newby points out that early treatment of Lyme disease with like basic antibiotics like doxycycline and other easily made antibiotics can be very effective in treating Lyme disease. But the medical establishment does not want an easy fix. There's no money in that, after all. If an over-the-counter medicine that's already well-made and well-tested could fix a problem, where's the money in that? You know, so they keep trying to. Kris Newby highlights that they keep trying to push original drugs, you know, original and novel drugs that will help with Lyme disease and Lyme disease only, because over-specialized medicines can bring in a lot of money. And obviously Kris Newby was not writing it with this mindset because this was before COVID, but it really kind of reminded me of what was going on during COVID, because you had this huge push for COVID vaccines, and there was this big thing of, oh, you have to take these specific medicines to deal with COVID, you have to take these specific vaccines, and any other treatments that were posited by any medical authority were quickly shouted down as being, oh, that's no good. I remember there were treatments with drugs like ivermectin. I think quinine was mentioned at one point. And these were medicines that were outright demonized at the time, despite quinine being, I think that was being used all the way back in the 1800s. And ivermectin had been a widely used drug that was specifically designed for humans. But you know, during COVID, they say, oh no, it's only animals can use it. And it's like, well, tell that to all the Japanese pharmacists who helped make it and specifically made it for humans. But you know, you couldn't have an easy treatment for COVID. You need to have something specific, because where's the money in doing a wide-ranging treatment that already exists? You know, so Kris Newby kind of goes into that, and there were a lot of parallels with COVID. Obviously, Newby would have had no idea about this when she wrote this, but there were a lot of interesting parallels to the COVID pandemic that I was seeing here, and particularly how the medical establishment sort of quashed any possibility of different treatments. I also kind of like how the story highlights how short-sighted government programs can be, because the whole idea behind Willy Burgdorfer's career is that the Cold War is happening. You know, he goes over to the Rocky Mountains right around the time World War II is ending, and the American-Soviet relationship is deteriorating, and the Cold War is starting up. And the U.S. government wants to get a leg up on the Soviets, and so they have this idea, oh, well, we should make a biological weapon that can incapacitate the Soviets without affecting our men. And it gets to a point that they're willing to experiment on their own citizens. And technically the citizens agreed to it. The government told them, well, we're going to inject you and expose you to a lot of stuff that may hurt you down the line. So it was voluntary, but again, how again, when you're injecting someone and exposing them to so many different agents, there's kind of a level of ethics that's violated there. And this story makes it clear that the biological weapons program was a deeply immoral and dangerous thing to do. And it was forcing the U.S. government to... Well, no, it wasn't forcing them. They just decided they were going to experiment on their own citizens. They talk about things where volunteers are put into a giant cylinder called the 8-ball, and they're forced to breathe in these aerosol contaminants of bacteria and viruses and other microbes. And again, it was voluntary. The test subjects did it voluntarily, but again, it's just kind of one of those things you're like, oh man, what, you're really going to that point? They talk about this one experiment, I don't remember what it was called, but it was a project where they dropped a bunch of mosquitoes in a Florida town and tested to see whether the mosquitoes could spread microbes at a reasonable rate. And yeah, and that was not on voluntary subjects. That was just something the U.S. biological weapons guys say, oh, hey, let's do this in this small Florida town. Well, maybe it wasn't small. I think it was a mid-sized town somewhere. But yeah, it just kind of makes you go, whoa, how much the U.S. government was experimenting on its own citizens, both voluntarily and involuntarily. Excuse me. Probably the most cynical event of this is that there's this event called the Dugway Proving Ground incident in Utah, and these planes are dropping a nerve gas called the VX nerve gas to test to see if they can drop it accurately. Well, unfortunately, they didn't drop it accurately, and the gas drifted outside the ground, and it killed like 2,000 sheep on a nearby ranch. It was such a big deal that there was international condemnation, and the biological weapons program was only canceled after that incident. But that's kind of telling that they were experimenting with all this nasty stuff, and it only ended because there was bad press. It was like, it wasn't like the suffering of its own citizens, or the fact that it maimed thousands of animals. It was just, it's bad press. It's kind of like, it's such a deeply cynical reason to end it. but it's like the whole thing is cynical. Like you go through all this trouble, and then you just sort of cancel it because like, we're getting some bad press. Let's move on. And it's like that in some ways makes it worse because it's like you ruined several people's lives with diseases you couldn't control, and then you just drop the whole thing like, whatever. It didn't work out. Let's move on. It's like, wow, that's really callous. And the other thing I really liked about this book was that it showed how the initial Lyme outbreak happened. For those that don't know, Lyme disease first popped up in Lyme, Connecticut, and I believe it was in the 1970s. Hold on, I'll look at this quick. It was 1970. Oh, my mistake. It was 1968. Oh, no. My mistake. It was listing the different diseases that were popping up in the Lyme, Connecticut area. A bunch of strange diseases, and then the Lyme disease officially started popping up in Lyme, Connecticut in 1972. So it goes into a lot of this interesting detail about how the Lyme outbreak happened and how, as I just said, there were a bunch of other strange diseases that shouldn't have been in the Long Island, Connecticut area that were happening. And just sort of showing the slow realization of all the scientists that, oh, something is popping up. This is a new pandemic, and just sort of that growing realization among the medical professionals and government figures that, ooh, something is coming. And worst of all, a lot of the governments are not, state and local governments aren't prepared for it, and they aren't given much resources to work with to fight this new disease. So it's a really kind of shocking exploration of just how, when pandemics pop up, it can be very hard to navigate them and prevent the outbreak from getting worse. So it's a very disheartening read in that respect, because it's showing that, well, most of the time your government is going to be so flimsy and poorly managed that you're not going to be helped by them all that much. So it's a distressing read, but it's probably an honest one in that respect. So I found that very interesting and well done. So that's the stuff I really liked about the book. There are a few things that I didn't like about the book, though. Probably the main thing I noticed is that, as I said, this is a nonfiction narrative, and it has a lot of threads through it. Like, a lot of it is talking about Willy Burgdorfer, a lot of it is talking about Kris Newby and her investigation. There's a section where they both come together because both Newby and Burgdorfer meet each other. There's the narrative about the first initial Lyme outbreak. So there's a lot of different things going on. And the weird thing I notice is that the writing is much stronger and overall better when it's discussing Willy Burgdorfer and the elements of the outbreak than on... All of that stuff is stronger than whenever Kris Newby is writing about stuff she was personally involved in. Which is strange, because you would think that the Willy Burgdorfer stuff, if she had more distance from that, you would think that she'd be able to write what she personally experienced with a little more, flavor and sense of emotion. But that's not the case. Like, weirdly enough, when it's talking about Willy Burgdorfer or anybody else regarding the outbreak, the writing is really crackling. It works really well. But when it's focused on Kris Newby herself, it feels much weaker, and I'm not entirely sure why that is. It could be because the stuff with Willy Burgdorfer and the biological weapons program, required much more scholarship, and it required Newby to like really think, oh, what are these people thinking? What are the elements of these documents I can use? Whereas the stuff Newby experienced, maybe she just didn't feel as pressured to have that same amount of passion, because after all, sometimes the things you experience yourself, even though you're passionate about them, sometimes it's hard to get that emotion on a page, because sometimes the things that you are personally feeling and experiencing, they're so magnified in your mind that you think, oh, if I just say this and this, people will understand what I'm getting at. But that's not always the case. Sometimes what you write down and is very engaging and passionate to you is not necessarily for the reader, because we don't have the same context as when you wrote it. So that's my suspicion for why maybe the Kris Newby focus sections are not as strong. That may or may not be the case, but that's how it felt to me. When it's focused on Burgdorfer, it's really good. When it's focused on Newby, the quality seems to drop a little bit, at least in terms of execution. The other really big issue I have with the book kind of comes towards the end, because by this point, Willy Burgdorfer's out of the picture. He's passed away. It's more focused on Newby's investigation. And the last few chapters just have a lot of moments where Newby is writing about her experiences, and they feel kind of theatrical and like a little jazzed up, like things that had happened to her are kind of escalated in a way that doesn't feel quite real. It feels kind of like, oh, she jazzed up whatever this thing, which I know this is a nonfiction narrative, but as someone who has done nonfiction work and studied creative nonfiction in college, I can guarantee you that plenty of nonfiction writers are creative with what they say about what supposedly happened in real life. That doesn't mean that they're lying. It just means that there are sometimes exaggerations or maybe downplaying of certain elements that happened in real life, either because they'd be kind of clunky to include in a book, or because the author feels strongly about certain things and maybe adjust their delivery based on how they feel about the subject. And there's just a lot of moments towards the end where it feels like Newby jazzes things up to be a little more dramatic, which may not be the case. Maybe she's being 100% honest when these moments happen, but they just don't feel real. And I know that's a weird thing to criticize, but when the whole point of the book is seeing how Lyme disease has affected people, when you get these moments that feel like really jazzed up and like they've been written for a dramatic movie, they just really stand out compared to the level tone that was going on throughout the rest of the book. Probably the one that really stood out to me is at one point Kris Newby runs into one of the doctors who had looked at her when she and her husband had first caught Lyme disease, and her former doctor apologizes for misdiagnosing her, and then gives this speech that, like, oh, you were a huge inspiration to me with all your work. I'm fighting for the victims. I actually want to read this section because it really it really comes off as like kind of Hollywood schmaltz. Okay, here we go. Quote, "He smiled, ran up to me, and enveloped me in a hug. You were the inspiration for this research. Your courage in going against the establishment inspired me." Then he thumped his heart with a fist and said, "This is for the patients. I wanted to do the same as what you're doing for tick-borne diseases." And I just read that section, I go, did the whole bus then stand up and start clapping? You know, like, it had that energy of like, boy, like you're making it sound like the Hollywood movie that'd be made from this book rather than what actually happened. And like I said, maybe that totally did happen. Maybe the doctor did do that. But Newby does not convey it in a way where I buy that he did that. So again, it's just kind of like this feels more like from the script of like the Hollywood adaptation of the book rather than something that actually happened in real life. And it just really sticks out. There's also kind of a reveal after this chapter. Newby goes to visit her parents, and both of her parents happen to have a history with biological weapons. And this is all... her father was in Vietnam and was exposed to Agent Orange. And her mother is suffering from dementia. And one of the suggestions that Newby has woven throughout the book is that prolonged Lyme disease can possibly be an aggravating factor of dementia. And the problem is when these two things are revealed, they're revealed like almost at the very end. And it's kind of like they come so late that it comes off like a shock reveal. Like, oh, Kris Newby was always tied to Lyme disease. Her family had always been affected by biological weapons. And it's kind of like... it just kind of comes off as like insincere, even though I know it wasn't meant to be that way. It comes off like you're saying, oh, see, I was actually affected by this stuff throughout my whole life because my mother and my father were exposed to these things. It's sort of like, I don't know, something about it, the fact that it's towards the end feels like way too much of a shock reveal. Like it was put there to say, oh, you see, Kris Newby, she was destined to go after the Lyme disease. It's like, that wasn't really necessary. Like I said, I'm sure it's true. I'm sure her parents were exposed to Lyme disease and Agent Orange. But again, the way she's writing about it just feels too Hollywoodish. Like, and even Hollywood would probably have put this reveal of them being affected by biological weapons probably earlier in the film script. So... Again, I don't want to sound mean towards people who actually did suffer from these things, but again, that's sort of like, well, I feel like Kris Newby should have made that element of her background maybe a little more clear up front. So there, also in that same scene, there's a thing where her father warns Kris, be sure you don't get killed because of this book that you're writing on Lyme disease. And it's kind of like, all right, did you have to go there? Again, maybe her father totally said this, but when you end it, because the chapter actually ends with him giving that warning. And it's kind of like, okay, you're getting a little carried away, Newby. You're trying to make this a Hollywood feature, but that's not necessarily effective for what you're trying to do. Because now it comes off like, with this and the doctor praising the other time, it's becoming a little self-inflating. Like saying, oh, you're so important that this doctor praises you and your father's worried that you're going to be killed over the book. And it's like, okay, like that feels a little. It reaches the point of going from like a believable uh, thing that Kris Newby experienced, and more like a thing of like, oh, uh, I'm I'm a warrior for virtue and fighting the good fight, and sort of like, okay, it's reaching the point. It doesn't quite get to like egotistical levels, but you know, there is a little bit of self-inflation there. I think it's like, I and I think that if these things really did happen, Kris Newby is well within her means to include them. But again, maybe she should have done a little bit of the creative nonfiction and maybe phrased them a little more creatively, or maybe placed them places in the book where it would be more reasonable for them to be there. So, yeah, just those jazzed up moments where it kind of feels like Kris Newby is writing a script for a Hollywood film instead of like a grounded book. Those parts kind of took me out of the story because they're way too on the nose. I guess my my last criticism, I would say, is it's also kind of with the ending of the book. Newby kind of tries to end her book with like a proper ending, like she goes to an area not too far from Hamilton, Montana, and she looks out and she reflects on the history of America and the history of how trying to manipulate the land leads to disaster. And you know, it's kind of that like, again, not to I'm sorry to come back to this, but it's like a Hollywood film where the heroine has won the good fight and she's staring off in the distance because she knows there's so much to do, and it's looking over. I'm like, okay, this is getting a little this is getting a little too schmaltzy, in my opinion, because it just takes you out of it just seeing this thing. Because Newby's trying to give her story a proper ending because Willy Burgdorfer's story has a proper ending because he dies, you know, so there's not much more Kris Newby can add to his story. So he has a proper ending, and Newby's kind of trying to do a ending where she kind of has this, you know, the fight continues sort of deal, but I think it just doesn't entirely work. Thankfully, there's an epilogue right after that sort of talks about what Kris Newby is pushing the government and for medical professionals to do, and so the book ends on a decent enough note with that epilogue, but just that penultimate chapter feels, yeah, that just didn't work for me. Okay, so I will now do my final ranking of Bitten. And I rank on a system of 0 to 5 stars, 0 out of 5 being terrible, and 5 out of 5 being great. I would say Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons is a solid 4 out of 5 stars, which is a good book in my ranking system. Like I said, I know I was going on for a while about some of my criticisms of Newby's ending excesses and the weak writing in places, but I really focused on those because those were the only things that really stood out to me in terms of badness. Because the rest of the book, I think, does a good job at discussing Willy Burgdorfer's career and the hazards of biological weapons. So I only talked about the bad stuff a fair amount because it stood out from an otherwise very good book. So I would definitely recommend this for folks to read, especially if you have an interest in like biological weapons and their history, whether in the United States or elsewhere. Or if you have been affected by Lyme disease, I would recommend you checking this out. So, yeah, I would give and even if you aren't any of those things, I would recommend this. It's a very interesting read, and it really highlights the very real probability that Lyme disease probably came from a government lab. Like I said, it's kind of a gray area. There's a lot of debate about it, but a lot of the evidence I've seen has said, yeah, there's a pretty good chance it broke loose from a lab. But yeah, so check this book out if it seems interesting. Inspiration. For those that don't know, I am a working writer, and I will often use inspiration from books I've read for my own books. And so I always like talking at the end of my reviews about whether the books that I've discussed have inspired me in any way. And I can say definitively with Bitten that yes, it very much has inspired me. Because I've always, even before COVID, I'd always sort of been playing this idea of a horror story about an outbreak. Ironically, it happened on that same Virginia, the first version of the story I was thinking of happened on that same Virginia trip where my father didn't want to go near horses. So it's been sitting with me for a while, and I think Bitten has inspired me to not do the old thing of like saying, oh, the virus just appears out of nowhere, and makes me want to write a story about an outbreak coming from a biological weapons facility, because there are a lot of them apparently. And in fact, my aunt used to live near Manhattan, Kansas, which is where the new National Bio and Agro Defense Facility moved from. I believe it was Plum Island off the coast of New York, and that was a decision that was heavily criticized by many residents because you're taking all the deadly diseases and putting them right in the middle of America. So I think I've been hearing about that for the last few years from my aunt in Kansas. So there's definitely some inspiration there for a possible outbreak happening from that facility. So and this story is definitely proven to me, yeah, there are plenty of ways for a disease to escape, as well as, well, you know, COVID kind of taught us that too. But yeah, so definitely inspired by this. It's probably more accurate to say it's an inspiration on top of other inspirations. So, but yeah, definitely inspired by this. All right, well, that is all I have to say about this book, so that's where I'm going to end it. Thank you to anyone who was listening or watching or both. And I will be back in the next few days with more book reviews. All right. Bye.